As someone who's been paying attention to the draft for around 11 years now, I've seen players enter the league and grow in their careers, starting out as prospects garnering speculation from fans and media, to becoming full-blown superstars, busts, role players, and everything in between. One thing that I've noticed throughout these past drafts is that there are a few different types of archetypes of players that I see fail a lot more than they succeed. And with the nature of the draft, it seems that there's always a discussion about upside and best case scenario of what a player could be entering the league. But as I've said on this channel and in videos before this, I like to think of the draft in a much more realistic way. Not every player becomes a superstar they may have been hyped to be, and as a general manager of a team, I personally would think to avoid these three types of players specifically in the draft to minimize my potential of drafting a bust and minimize my risk all the same. And so with that being said, the three main archetypes that I don't think should be trusted entering the draft each year, and specifically this year, is one, the small guard who's a bucket getter, really shifty, has some highlights, but does not defend well at all. I don't think that really contributes to winning basketball. Second, the unpolished wing with a ton of potential, but doesn't really have a shooting ability established. And finally, the immobile, but also very dominant collegiate center. And so yes, these types of players have entered and flourished in the league, but in general, I wouldn't be too excited about drafting them because there is a historical precedent for their failure more often than not. Fitting into these molds, I see Rob Dillingham being that type of guard, Ron Holland fitting in as that type of forward, and Zach Hemsey being in that type of center as three players who I think fit pretty well into these archetypes. And for that reason, I don't entirely trust them as prospects. Obviously, these guys could all enter and kill it in the league, and I would cheer them on all the way. But to be a little more realistic as a scout and as an evaluator of talent, these three players fit the buckets of a player that I would be afraid of drafting. So to kick things off, Rob Dillingham is the first prospect that I think has a high chance of not panning out in the league and not fulfilling what potentially the media is thinking his hype could be. And he fits into the archetype of a non-defending, small bucket-getting guard. So although he had an amazing season offensively last year, which saw him averaging 15 points per game, shooting 45% from three, and dishing out 4 assists per game, I think his star upside is significantly overstated, and his upside is lower than what the eye test might say. He's really sticky with the ball and doesn't really command much off-ball attention, and so most of the value he provides to teams is what he can do when he has the basketball, which in the NBA will be significantly lower than it was in college. And so while his highlights are, yes, very impressive, his lack of defensive efficacy kept him as a sixth man for Kentucky last year. And sure, yes, he might have won SEC Sixth Man of the Year, and that's great and all, but he's likely going to be targeted and dusted by scorers in the NBA. Especially when it comes down to these smaller guards in the league, they need to be absolutely unbelievable and have a crazy offensive arsenal of finishing moves, shooting moves, passing, and good off-ball presence alongside great versatile fenders all around them to keep them on the lineup on the floor. And so when you look at Dillingham, he's going to need a perfect storm to potentially even reach that all-star upside. And you think of guys like Trae Young, who a lot of chatter is right now, is can he pair well with guys like DeJounte Murray? Does he have any type of off-ball presence? And obviously the defense is one of the worst in the league. And so Dillingham was in the 17th percentile for overall defensive efficiency last year, and the film makes it look honestly even worse than what the numbers say. He's measured at 6'1" without shoes, but he looks even smaller on the court, and he admitted himself that he doesn't really defend in an interview I watched recently. And so yes, he has an okay-ish motor, but even with that, offensive players will definitely prefer to see him in front of them, and they'll pick him apart in the NBA for sure. Since he's so small, he gets caught up in screens pretty often, and that small frame leads to him being frequently blown by. I mean, guys pretty much just walk right past him. I think it's really funny. He's almost like if the term "right this way, sir" was a basketball player, and it's pretty sad to watch these clips. He just lets guys go right by him and then will switch on to a shooter, which almost creates a mismatch in and of itself. And so on the positive side, in every interview I have seen, Rob has been incredibly hungry and definitely humble coming into the league and really wants to make something happen, which drive is pretty important when it comes to these NBA guys because character is a big part of the equation. And so based off his career progress so far, I can see the excitement there, He went from Dawn Academy to Overtime Elite to Kentucky, and through every stage, every step of the way, he's been really coachable and willing to work pretty hard at becoming a good pro and a winning pro, although those programs don't really have the reputation for system guys and winning guys. But, there is a chance. And so if I had to say which career outcome is most likely for Dillingham, I'd say the Bones Highland route is probably most likely, in my opinion. I can see Dillingham being someone who falls out of rotation for a strong championship contender, but puts up some fun clips and big stats for more middle of the pack or lower end teams. And so unfortunately for Rob, he fits into the mold of what is my least favorite draft prospect, which, like I said, is the shifty, not very defensively focused small guard. And yes, there are a decent amount of success stories from this archetype though, so I'm not completely writing him off, but I really do think it's unlikely that he develops into an all-star caliber player or even a reputational winner for that matter. And now looking in the last 10 drafts, I'd have Rob Dillingham's draft profile compared to guys like Jaden Hardy, Cam Thomas, Cole Anthony, Tyrese Maxey, Trae Young, D'Angelo Russell, Fred VanVleet, James Bouknight, Sharif Cooper, Dennis Smith Jr., and like I said, Bones Highland. And so this archetype, yes, does produce valuable NBA players, but when looking at the comparisons, it's easy to see how this is such a troubling type of player. A lot of the guys I listed have had lots of questions about whether or not they can actually contribute to winning basketball throughout their careers, and I can see similar conversations circling around Rob a few years down the line. And I think thinking about possible landing spots for him within his mock range, I think he needs to be in a spot where he can be a backup point guard right away and really get those reps of being just a spark plug, and also have some guys on defense who can cover up some holes for him. And so I'm thinking Charlotte at 6, Memphis at 9 are probably the best two locations for him to go. And I think worst case scenario, like disaster locations, would be Atlanta at 1, Houston at 3, Portland at 7, and Washington at 2 as an honorable mention. Although Ron Holland had one of the best statistical seasons for any prospect to come through the ranks of G League Ignite, I'm frightened by his inability to shoot and lack of deferring on offense. He stands at 6'6.5" without shoes and has a 6'10.5" wingspan and a 39-inch vertical as well, and so obviously he has excellent measurables that are right in line with any NBA wing. And Holland put up numbers of 19.5 points, 6.7 rebounds, 3 assists, and 2.5 steals per game in G League Ignite, which, like I said, is the best Ignite season I've seen. And with that, he shot 45% from the field overall, but a measly 24% from 3 on 3.6 attempts per game, which is way higher volume than you would want for someone who's such a poor shooter. And given these percentages and the fact that Ignite went only 2-32 on the season, I'm mainly worried about Holland's ability to stay on the floor and be an actual contributor to winning basketball. Although he's truly lethal as a driver and very active in passing lanes, this strong inability to shoot the basketball and strong desire to do so at the wing position limits his ability to make any sort of real impact, especially coming in as a rookie. And the mechanics do look fine, but he's really going to need to get in the gym and figure out his jumper before, in my opinion, he can be a winning player. In the modern NBA, with modern spacing, wings have to shoot to be able to play. It's pretty much a non-negotiable. So I'm scared by his 13th percentile jump shooting efficiency, and I don't think it's a hot take to be afraid in this way. Because since spacing is so important in the NBA, having a wing who, sure, he can finish well and he can defend, but he doesn't really have a position at that height to effectively be on the court. You have to be able to shoot, at least at a competent level. And so I really am scared at how he'll translate. And obviously it's important to consider that he took a jump straight from high school to the G League, and so that includes shooting at the NBA line now. But as we saw with Scoot Henderson last season, bad shooting years on Ignite translate to the league. It's not like they immediately get better, and so I am definitely worried there. And my comps for this type of player from the past in drafts are in this archetype of the great finishing wing who has shown off shot creation chops, but maybe not at the percentages you would like, and is very raw, but really athletic at the same time. This archetype has a lot of people coming in the past 10 years volatile once again, and that's really what is scary to me. But without further ado, here are the comps. Josh Jackson, Jaylen Brown, RJ Barrett, Cam Whitmore, Jonathan Kuminga, Patrick Williams, Jarrett Culver, Cam Reddish, Sekou Doumbouya, Kevin Knox, Stanley Johnson, Jabari Parker, Julius Randle, and I think we can probably put Cody Williams in this bucket as well. And I would think also in this draft, we can go with Matas Buzelis at the same time. But I think the difference for Cody Williams here is, even though, yeah, he's very raw when it comes to dribbling and things like that, Cody Williams was a 40% three-point shooter last season, and that's why I would have him much higher projection-wise than Holland. And as you can see, these guys don't pan out exactly as much as you would hope for from a high lottery position, but everybody wants to take a stab at that type of do-it-all wing, and it's why Holland might be drafted high, but there's also a high chance he doesn't get drafted high. And the volatility is really what is stark to me, because a lot of times GMs like to take gambles on guys like this, but there is such a historical precedent for failure, similarly with the small guards and Ron Holland, and Rob Dillingham and those types of guys. And so with that historical precedent, within the last 10 years, the risk could be too great for many GMs to take this risk, but I think there will absolutely be one just daring enough to make a play at the upside, especially when you consider that Ron Holland is 18 years old. And at the end of the day, if he does figure out the jumper and reach what the potential could be, we are looking at an all-NBA type of guy maybe. And given various mock drafts, I think best case landing spots for him would be a place that can be patient with his development and that also doesn't have a lot of wings up and down the rotation, so he can really kind of get in, see where he fits in, and try to figure things out. So I think Charlotte at 6, San Antonio at 8, assuming they move off of some guys, and Utah at 10 are all good, realistic landing spots for him. I don't really think there are a lot of amazing spots for him up and down this draft. And I think probably worst case scenario for realistic Holland landing spots would be Portland at 7, Memphis at 9, and Chicago at 11. I don't think those would be teams that might put him in the best case to maximize what he has. To talk about Zach Edey, obviously the thing that stands out the most for him is his measurables. At 7'4", 300 pounds, and with a standing reach of 9'7", Edey is pretty much just another basket running around the court. And the biggest issue to notice with him is his mobility, and this may be the thing that prohibits him from having a successful NBA career. Yes, although he had one of the more dominant collegiate runs in history, in which he averaged 25 points, 12 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks in his senior year, and winning the College Basketball Player of the Year twice, his play style has a historical precedent, just like these other guys, for having the biggest drop-off in translation from NCAA or at G League Ignite or overseas to the pros. And if we look back at some comparisons from the past 10 drafts, guys like Oscar Tshiebwe, Luka Garza, Rakeem Christmas, Kofi Cockburn, Adama Sanogo all entered the league following dominant seasons in college at the center position, but then didn't translate. And the things that led to their downfall was the lack of shooting and the lack of mobility, and it makes them nightmarish in practice when entering the league. I wouldn't say that Edey plays like any of those guys I just mentioned though, but the archetype is what I'm saying kind of scares me. Edey is a much better rim protector compared to them, and his offensive skill set surpasses them as well, and so he's definitely the best that I've seen from this archetype by a mile, but I still am concerned. The lack of success in the league from these types of guys are also the reason why they typically end up waiting until around their junior or senior year to even begin to test the waters with their draft stock in the first place. And it's without a doubt that Edey has great touch and interior presence, and he has also vastly improved in space as a screener roller in recent years, and that's what's led to him being mocked so high. But the lack of mobility may make things difficult for me. And it's hard for me to envision him really producing at a high level in the NBA on the offensive end, especially since post play is significantly less demanded in the league than in college, and he won't get that volume. So the true issue with Edey though is that the pace of play in the NBA is just so much faster than college, and spacing is much more pronounced as well. While Edey will definitely be at least an above average rim protector, teams will assuredly play him off the floor by putting him in various screening actions, and I'm worried that he might be so immobile that he has to switch more often than not, which would lead to a disaster mismatch on the perimeter. And the difference between Edey and say a Wembanyama or a Porzingis of guys around that height is that their movement can supplement their height, whereas with Edey, it's more of a burden. And I fear he may be prone to not only getting exposed on defense, but also run into things like offensive fouls, moving screens, and defensive 3-second calls on the offensive end, because he's just not as coordinated and as quick to avoid these things for someone of that height and for someone who weighs that much. So for Edey, the best case scenario would be a team that can give him backup minutes right away and make an attempt for him to prove himself as a winning role player, since he would project to be this type of guy over an upside guy. Because he's played 4 years in college, maybe the 3 is something he can develop down the line. He did it well at the combine, but realistically, he's mostly going to be a rim runner and a rim protector. And considering his position in various mocks, I think Zach Edey's camp could be happy with him ending up in Philly at 16, LA at 17, Phoenix at 22, and if we're reaching, OKC at 12. I'd say worst case scenario for Edey would be Portland at 14, Orlando at 18, and possibly Cleveland at 20. And so like I said, this does not mean that these guys that I've mentioned won't have successful NBA careers. I'm just bringing up these archetypes and showing you guys the film to mention and demonstrate that not every player coming into the league has an equal chance of reaching the ceiling that a lot of media members like to talk about and like to give best case scenarios for. In fact, more often than not, people in these archetypes tend to fail. And so they totally could become high NBA role players, but the probability is low. They could be stars, they could be role players, the probability, like I said, less likely than it would be for guys who aren't in that archetype. The high level shooting wing, or the dynamic passing big guard, or the quick rim running center are more safer bets than what I've mentioned with these guys. And so, like I said, low chance, but I'll be rooting for them, and hopefully I'm wrong, because that's where all the fun is with the draft anyways.